50,000 Rand a month. I'm going to talk about 50,000 Rand repeatedly on this episode, so I'm going to need you to hold that figure in your head for a while because I'm going to talk about 50,000 Rand a month. Now, here's a question. What does 50,000 Rand mean to you? If you're a founder, it might be your first developer hire. If you're ahead of growth, that's your entire digital ad budget for the quarter. And if you're just getting started, it might be 18 months of runway in a lean operation. But here's the punchline. For a specific category of South African founders right now, namhlanje, that 50,000 isn't an investment. It's not building anything. It's not generating a single lead or shipping a single feature. It is, in my terms, the price of keeping the lights on. So there's a mythology in the startup world that needs to die, and I want to kill it today on this episode in this room. Majority of you all have heard about it, the story of the garage. You have two guys, a laptop, a dream, a garage somewhere in Palo Alto or Menlo Park, and 3 years later, these guys basically are worth billions of dollars. And I don't want to lie to you, that story is real, that story did happen, and that story is functionally irrelevant to you if you're building in Sandton or Khayelitsha or Rustenburg or even Durban North. Because the guys in Palo Alto, what they worried about in their garage was the Wi-Fi password. Like seriously, their biggest infrastructure problem was whether the router was close enough to their workbench. So these guys, man, I mean, think about it. They had uninterrupted cheap grid electricity. They had roads that worked. So couriers arrived when the app said they would. They had water coming out of their tap, so they stayed hydrated, focused, and sharp. And they had one job, which was to write code and ship product. Now, let's go to the other garage. Same dream, same ambition, same laptop. Okay, maybe, but probably older. But the checklist before you can even open that laptop is Eskom supplying power today and for how long? Is the backup generator fuel, and has the guard confirmed the copper cables haven't been stripped overnight? Is the internet up, or did the fiber get cut again during the road construction that's been ongoing for like 11 months? Can the delivery your supplier was supposed to bring actually arrive, or is the entry jammed because Transnet delays backed up the whole supply chain again? You see, by the time you've answered those 4 questions, your counterpart in Palo Alto has already pushed 2 commits and sent a product update to like 50,000 users. You see, that is the innovation penalty, not just the cost, not just the cognitive overhead, but the pre-game before the game. Now, let's get precise because I'm not here to complain. I'm here to do the math. So that 50K figure that I opened up with wasn't a metaphor. I want to actually build it in front of you line by line. So let's start with the generator itself. A mid-sized 15K V8 diesel unit. That's what you need to run a modest dev shop or a cold chain node with consistent uptime. And it will burn approximately 2.7 liters of fuel per hour. And if you run that formula, that would be 2.7 liters per hour times 24 hours times 30 days. And we'll get a whopping 1,944 liters per month. And if you look at our current inland diesel prices, which is sitting around 26 Rand 0.50 cents per liter, we'll times that with the 1,944 liters and we'll get a whopping 51,516 Rand per month just on fuel. But that fuel number isn't the number, it's the anchor, because we need to also consider other factors like, let's say, your maintenance and service contracts on a commercial generator. That will cost you about 3,000 to 6,000 Rand per month minimum. How about a dedicated security guard to prevent like your cable theft, which, by the way, is not a hypothetical. South Africa loses an estimated 7 billion annually to cable theft. So you need a body there. And that would cost you about 12,000 to 18,000 per month for reputable servers. How about sound dampening or noise compliance? Let's say if you're in a mixed-use area, which will have some installation cost amortized over months, plus potential municipal fines if you're not compliant. How about fuel storage and compliance, which you may need a certified diesel tank on premises, which will trigger your SANT regulation. And we have to also include your legal installation cost. But finally, the one line nobody talks about, which is your cognitive tax on your management team. You see, every hour a founder or operation lead spends managing generator logistics or vendor call and load sharing schedule is an hour they are not managing the product. And by the time you add it all up, the honest operational cost of power resilience for a modest ground touch business is closer to 75,000 to 90,000 per month. But we'll keep calling it 50K because that's the conservative. That's the defensible floor. But understand, the ceiling is higher than most investors in your cap table have ever been told. Now, here's where this number stops being accounting, it starts being strategy. So, let me show you the opportunity cost because the real innovation penalty isn't the diesel bill, it's what the diesel bill prevents. So, option A, you spend, let's say, 50K on a power resilience. You maintain uptime, you keep your doors open, you don't generate a single new line of revenue from it, and you are essentially paying a survival subscription. That's option A. Option B, let's say you deploy that 50K as growth capital. And if you model a few scenarios, let's say you hire, let's say a junior dev. A competent junior dev in South Africa costs about 20K to 30K per month, fully loaded. 50K gets you one, with the budget left for tooling and equipment. That developer ships features, features acquire users, users generate revenue, and revenue compounds. How about we take that 50K and we put it in performance marketing basically, and 50K in a well structured, let's say, Google or Meta campaign for a B2B SaaS product to run properly could generate about 200 to 500 qualified leads, depending on the sector and conversion rate. So if your close rate is, let's say, 10% and the average contract value is about 5,000 per month, that's 100,000 to 250,000 in annualized recurring revenue from a single month of spend just on performance marketing. How about we hire, let's say, a customer success? For a subscription business, a dedicated CS manager at 25,000 per month who reduces churn by even 2% per month on a book of, let's say, 500K ARR saves you 10,000 per month in lost revenue. You see, that compounds over a year into over 120,000 in retained revenue forever. So do you see what I'm doing? In every one of those scenarios, that 50K is working, it's compounding, it's building something. But in the diesel scenario, it's evaporating month after month without generating a single rand of new value. So this is what I mean when I say the innovation penalty forces South African founders to spend Series A energy on pre-seed infrastructure. So you are fighting a war on two fronts. You are building a business and maintaining the environment in which the business can exist. Your competitor in Amsterdam is only fighting one war. And we wonder why our founding rounds are smaller and our multiples are lower. So that's the micro picture. One founder, one generator, 1 month. Now here's the question that should be making you feel uncomfortable. How did we get here? Because this isn't an accident. This is the result of decades of decisions, and the business consequences of those decisions are still being counted in trillions. So I want to be extremely clear about what this section is not. That is not a political rant. I'm not going to stand here and tell you who to vote for or who to blame or what party caused what. That's not the show. That's not what moves your business forward. But what I am going to do is treat South Africa's infrastructure collapse as what it actually is, a business case study. An MBA case study so brutal and instructive that it should be taught in every startup school on the continent. Because here's the thing about case studies. You can learn from them without loving through them. And if you are loving through this one, the least you can do is understand the structure of what's happening to you. So we're going to go to the data itself. So in 2023, and I want you to mark this year, load shedding alone extracted 2.8 trillion from the South African economy. 2.8 trillion. So let me give you context for that number because trillion figures tend to make people's eyes glaze and we are conditioned to hear large numbers and feel nothing. So here's the human translation. So South Africa's annual venture capital deployment into the tech startups across all sectors, all stages, is measured in hundreds of millions of rand. But we're going to call it a generous 1.5 billion in an active year. The power cuts cost us 2,000 times that amount in a single year. So we are destroying the equivalent of nearly 2,000 years of venture capital investment annually just to keep a broken grid limping along. And that's just power. That's just Eskom. If you add Transnet, South Africa's ports and freight rail system, the arteries through which exports and imports and supply chains flow, generated losses of 253 billion rand in 2023. That's roughly 1 billion rand every single day. To give you a commercial anchor, 1 billion rand a day is more than the total daily revenue of many of the country's largest retailers. So we are bleeding an amount of money every 24 hours that would be let's say, a headline making revenue figure if it was earnings. So this is not a recession. This is not a funding winter. This is a structural hemorrhage, and it is specifically, disproportionately, and literally targeted at the companies that can least afford it. And I'm talking about your startups and your scale-ups here trying to do something new in South Africa. So I want to introduce a concept that I think reframes this entire conversation, and I'm calling it the infrastructure paradox. So here it is in one sentence. In the West, infrastructure is invisible. In Africa, infrastructure is a line item. So stay with me on that. You see, when a developer in Berlin writes code, they don't budget basically for electricity. They don't have a slide or a pitch deck that says
power continuity strategy.
When a logistics startup in Toronto builds its unit economics model, they don't add a buffer for the days the roads don't work or the freight rail system is down or anything like that. You see, infrastructure for them is a given. It's ambient. It's basically the water they swim in without noticing. But for us, it's on the P&L. It's in the operating agreement. It's the procurement decision, a compliance question, a board level risk item simultaneously. So this asymmetry has two massive consequences that most people miss. Which, number one, so the first consequence is it inflates your cost base invisibly. So when you pitch to a VC who was trained in Silicon Valley deal flows, they look at your operational cost and they see inefficiency. You see, they see a company that can't manage its margins, and what they're actually seeing is the price of existing in a broken environment. But because the cost doesn't show up in the mental model of how a tech company should run, it reads as a management problem. So this is why South African founders consistently underprice the infrastructure cost when talking to investors, because they are embarrassed by it. They hide it, and then 12 months in, the company runs out of runway because nobody modeled the diesel bill properly. That's the first consequence. The second consequence is it consumes your decision-making bandwidth, and that should be reserved for growth. But the research we've been tracking on executive decision fatigue shows something very uncomfortable. And when you are making infrastructure decisions every day, which suppliers have power, which logistic routes are operational, whether to invest in a UPS system or a full generator install, you are depleting the exact same cognitive resource you need to make strategic decisions. And Elon Musk talks about spending zero mental energy on what he eats every day, so he has more capacity for like hard decisions. But South African founders are doing the complete opposite, because we are solving the electric grid before we can even think about product market fit. So that bandwidth cost doesn't show up in our accounts, but it is absolutely showing up in our growth rate. Now, here's where the macro gets interesting. And I say interesting, I mean terrifying and instructive in equal measure. The investment market noticed the infrastructure paradox and it adapted basically. Not in a way that helps you and I necessarily, but in a way you need to understand so you can position against it. You see, the venture capital data from January to July 2025 tells a very specific story. The total VC deployment into the South African tech was $48.7 million across just 4 deals. Just 4 deals. In a 7-month window, in an economy of 62 million people with one of the most sophisticated banking and tech sectors on the continent, we only had 4 deals. And here's the kicker. Of that $48.7 million, one company captured $38 million, which is Naked Insurance. Naked Insurance Series B2 round was 78% of all venture capital deployed in South African tech for the first half of 2025. Now, is Naked a bad company? No, they're not. They are excellent. But that concentration ratio tells you something fundamental about how the investor psychology has shifted. I mean, think about it this way. Imagine you are managing a fund You've watched 3 high-profile startups collapse in like quick succession, and when you dig into their post-mortems, you see the same thread every time. Infrastructure pressure turned a manageable challenge into a fatal one. Cash flow crisis triggered power cuts, logistic failures, and connectivity breakdowns. And what do you do the next time you evaluate the deal? You ask, does this business touch ground? And if it's a yes, if you need fight or if you need power or physical premises, the risk profile just went up, the model gets a haircut, and the conversation gets harder. But if it's a no, if this company lives entirely in the cloud, if it processes payments or underwrites risk or delivers software without needing Transnet rail network or Eskom's grid, you begin to lean in, because this is why fintech and insurtech captured the $9 million, which is 80% of all funding in the same period. Not because software is more innovative than logistic or culture, not because digital payments are more important than the last mile delivery infrastructure or agricultural tech, but because software doesn't need stable electricity in the same way a refrigerated warehouse does. So the investors haven't left, they've retreated to the cloud, and in doing so, they've created something I call the great mismatch. You see, we live in a continent that desperately needs physical infrastructure investment, but we are being served by a VC class that only wants to fund bits and not atoms. Now, here's the part where it compounds. And this is the part where macroeconomists understand, but they really explain in human terms. So the infrastructure crisis didn't just cost South African companies money, it concentrated the entire ecosystem. I mean, look at the overall economy. 2025 Q1, our GDP growth was 0.1%, which is barely a pulse, and yet the transport, the storage, the communication sectors grew at 2.4% in the same period. So what does that tell you? What does that mean? It means companies were spending heavily on workarounds, your redundant logistics, your alternative routing, your backup system. You see, the sector was growing not because of new demand, but because of friction. You see, the cost of navigating a broken system was big enough to register as an economic activity, which is kind of funny because, I mean, now what we're doing here in South Africa, we are measuring our survival cost as growth. And not only BNC sees it, but the banks see it too. So FNB trimmed their 2025 growth forecast to 1.6%. Bank of America went to 1.4%. Investec called a 1.3%. And Nedbank, one of the most conservative houses on the street, landed on 1.0%. So these guys, these aren't pessimists. These are analysts telling you that the fundamental operating environment is structurally impaired. And the South African Reserve Bank knows it too. They've cut the repo rate to 7.25% as of May 2025, trying to stimulate through cheap capital. But here's the line I keep coming back to.
Monetary policy cannot solve infrastructural physics.
So you can make money cheaper, but you cannot make diesel cheaper by cutting interest rates. You cannot fix Transnet rails backlog with a basis point adjustment. You see, the companies that failed, your 54 Collective, your Where's My Transport, your 54 Gene, they didn't fail because of bad ideas. They failed because infrastructure stress amplified every other challenge until there was no margin left to absorb the shock. That pattern, infrastructure pressure converting a manageable problem into a fatal one, is the defining business risk of building in South Africa right now. And the founders who don't understand it are playing the game without reading the rule book, which is exactly why we built this show. And now I'm going to go inside the founder's head because the innovation penalty isn't just financial, it's psychological. And that might be the most dangerous part of it all. So stay with me on this one because I want to actually ask you a question that's going to sound trivial until you actually think about it.
How many times did you check your load shedding app yesterday? Not today, yesterday, when you weren't even thinking about this conversation. Was it once, 3 times, before your morning meeting, during lunch, before you left the office?
So here's the uncomfortable truth. I'll bet you that you checked it more often than you checked your company's dashboard. More often than you reviewed your conversion funnel or your CAC to lifetime value ratio or any matrix that determine whether your business lives or dies. So you check the load shedding app today. There's no doubt about it. And here's why that matters more than you think. You see, there's a concept in behavioral psychology called decision fatigue. The research is pretty clear on this. It says humans have a finite capacity for high quality decision making in a given day. So every choice you make, even small ones, depletes that capacity. But so by the end of the day, you are making worse decisions, not because you are dumb, but because you are depleted. And Steve Jobs wore the same outfit every day to preserve decision making energy for hard calls. Obama did the same thing. Mark Zuckerberg, y'all know it, the gray t shirt and the same jeans. So that's not a fashion statement, that's cognitive load management. And here's the problem. You are a founder in South Africa in 2025, and before you can even start making product decisions, your go to market decisions, your hiring decisions, you are making infrastructure decisions. You already think about, is the power on? Do I need to reroute the delivery? Is the internet stable enough for the investors to call? Should I move the team meeting tomorrow because half of the company can't charge their laptops? So you are burning your decision making capacity on questions that for your competitors in stable markets don't exist. So that is the psychological text, and it is invisible until you name it. So let me tell you what does to strategic thinking. One of the most important skills a founder can develop is the ability to hold two timelines in your head simultaneously. So you need to be operating in the present, shipping this week's sprint, closing this month's deals, while simultaneously building for a future that's like 3 to 5 or 10 years out. So that you timeline thinking is what separates founders who build features from founders who build companies. But here's what happens when your present is uncertain and is in 2 hour increments. So you lose the future. Because when you don't know if the power will be on this afternoon, how do you justify spending cognitive energy on a 5 year product roadmap? When you don't know if your supplier can deliver next week because Transnet backlog is still growing, how do you commit to an 18-month scaling plan? You see, the uncertainty collapses your planning horizon entirely. So you start thinking in shorter and shorter cycles. You go from quarters to months to weeks to days. And eventually, if it gets bad enough, you stop planning altogether and you just react. And here's a cool irony. You see, the startups that win in any market, but especially in hard markets, are the ones that can maintain the longest planning horizon while executing in the shorter cycle. So they are playing a different game. They see 5 moves ahead while everyone else is stuck on the next turn. But the innovation penalty doesn't just tax your capital, it takes your time horizon. And if you can't think long term, you can't build long term. You see, this is one of the reasons, and I'm speculating here, but I think it's defensible, why so many South African startups end up looking like your consulting shops. I mean, they start as product companies with big visions, and then 3 years later, they are doing bespoke implementations for like corporate clients because that's the revenue model that works into our blocks. And not to say there's nothing wrong with service revenue, but if you started with the vision to build like the next Stripe or Shopify, and you end up building a service business because the infrastructure uncertainty made long-term product bets too risky, that's a psychological tax taking its card basically. Now, let's talk about the second order effect. The one that keeps me up at night more than your diesel bills. And I'm calling it the brain drain. Now here's the data, and I want you to sit with these numbers because they are worse than you think. So 49% of ICT practitioners in South Africa are actively considering working remotely for overseas employers. That's almost half of the entire sector. Now, why? And you might think it's salary, and I don't want to lie to you, salary is part of it. A senior developer in South Africa might make, let's say, 60K a month. That same developer working remotely for a company in London or San Francisco can pull about 80 to 120,000 annually, and in dollars. And that's like 120,000 to 200,000 rand a month at our current exchange rate. So the math is brutal, as you can see. And I'm not going to lie to you here and say salary isn't a factor, but here's what the surveys actually show when you dig into the reasons people are considering leaving. It's not just the money, it's the stability. It's the ability to work in an environment where the infrastructure is assumed, not negotiated. So when you're a developer working for a European company from your home in Cape Town, you control your environment, you install your own fiber, you buy your own UPS, you set up your own power backup, and if the power goes out, you log off for 2 hours and you log back on. You see, the company doesn't care because they measured your output on delivered code, not hours at your desk. But when you are working for a South African company that just mandated everyone back to the office because they can't guarantee that home setups will be stable during load shedding, you lose that autonomy. And that's exactly what's happening right now. The data from the return to office mandate tells a story that most executives aren't connecting to talent retention. 60% of South African employees have abandoned flexible work arrangements in the last 18 months. Vodacom ended their hybrid work policies entirely. Nedbank requires staff in offices for at least 3 days a week, including Mondays and Fridays, which conveniently are the days load shedding historically peaks. Arena Holdings went full return to office. And now, I'm not here to debate whether remote work is better or worse than office work. That's not the point. The point is, when you mandate a return to office in an infrastructure unstable environment, you are making a calculated trade-off. You are saying we prioritize operational certainty over talent competitiveness. And maybe that's the right call for your business. Maybe it is, but understand the cost. Because the research shows that 57% of remote jobs opportunities are concentrated in the ICT sector, the exact sector you need the most. And when you tell a top tier developer or designer or product manager that they need to come to the office 5 days a week in a city where commute might take about 2 hours because of traffic or infrastructure failures or even fuel costs, you look at the laptop and realize they could be working for a company in Berlin that offers full remote, higher pay, and stable infrastructure. What do you think they will choose? I mean, here's the compounding tragedy. South Africa produces about 32,141 STEM graduates annually. So we have a deficit of over 5,000 against our own national targets. And engineering alone is short of 2,541 graduates per year. So we are already losing the talent production war. And the graduates we do produce, computer science graduates, make up only 4.45% of all university graduates. And of those, nearly half are being recruited before they even finish their degrees by international companies offering remote packages. So we are training them, we are subsidizing their education, and then we are losing them before they ever contribute to the local economy. Because the innovation penalty doesn't just tax the companies that pay it, it taxes the talent that has to endure it. So, one last point before we move into strategy. And this one is a bit a sensitive topic. So, women constitute only 13% of STEM graduates in South Africa. The global average is 35%. That gap alone should be a national emergency. But here's how the innovation penalty makes it worse. The return to office mandates disproportionately impacts women. And this is not a conjecture, this is what the research shows. Women are still overwhelmingly responsible for caregiving in most households, like school pickups, doctor's appointments, and elder care. So flexible work arrangements weren't just a nice to have for women in tech, they were often the condition under which participation was possible. And when you remove those arrangements, because of infrastructure risk, you aren't just losing talent generically, you are specifically losing the diverse talent that every piece of research shows drives better decision making, better products, and better business outcomes. You see, the innovation penalty has a penalty within it, and the penalty is gender. So if we were serious about building a competitive tech sector in South Africa, we cannot ignore the fact that our infrastructure failures are systematically excluding half the population from participating at the level they could. And that's not a social justice talking point, that's just a business catastrophe. All right, that's a psychological tip. That's the cost you can't see on your P&L, but that is absolutely shaping your trajectory. Now let's talk about what you do with this information, because the thing about penalties, if you're going to pay them, and in South Africa right now you are already, you might as well extract value from the payment. So what I'm going to do is I'll talk about strategy, survival, and how to turn the tax into a moat. So Nassim Nicholas Taleb, the guy who wrote The Black Swan, has a concept called antifragility. Most people think the opposite of fragile is resilient or robust, something that can withstand shocks and stay intact, but Taleb says that's wrong. The true opposite of fragile isn't something that survives stress, it's something that gets stronger because of stress. That's antifragility. And it's the single most important mental model for South African founders right now. So if you are building a company in South Africa and you treat the innovation penalty as a problem to be solved, as something to minimize or hide or apologize for, you will lose, because you're fighting a battle you can't win. The infrastructure isn't getting fixed fast enough, not in the timeline your business needs. But if you treat the innovation penalty as a filter, as something that selects for a specific kind of company, and that specific kind of company is more competitive because of what it survived, you change the game entirely. You are not building a company despite the innovation penalty. You are building a company because of it. And here's why that refrain is so powerful. You see, every single operational challenge you are solving right now, you keeping uptime during load shedding, maintaining logistic despite Transnet failures, or building distributed teams when office mandates break down, every one of those challenges is teaching you how to operate in unstable environments. And you know what the majority of the global market looks like? Unstable environment. The South African founder who successfully navigated the innovation penalty isn't just locally competitive, they are globally dangerous. Because when you take the company to Nigeria or Kenya or Pakistan or Indonesia or even Brazil, markets that have similar worse infrastructure challenges, you don't need to learn how to operate there. You already know. You see, your competitors from Berlin, San Francisco, or even London, they are going to show up in those markets and discover that their playbooks don't work, that their unit economics break entirely, and that their logistics assumptions fail. But you've been living in that world. So you've been paying your tuition fees for years. And now that's your competitive advantage. That's anti-fragility, and that's how you win. But let's get tactical, because if you're going to turn the innovation penalty into a strategic asset, you need to do 3 specific things. I'm going to walk you through each one with enough detail that you can action this by tomorrow. So the first move is you stop hiding your cost and start charging for your uptime. This is the Resilience SLA. So here's how most South African B2B companies currently price their products. They look at the price fully loaded cost, salaries, software, infrastructure, their diesel, and they try to keep their pricing competitive with international alternatives. So they eat the infrastructure costs, they absorb them as overhead, and they hope the client doesn't notice. That is a losing strategy, because it means you are competing on price in a market where your cost base is structurally higher than your competitors. So you cannot win that game long term. But here's how you move. So go to your most important B2B client, not your biggest, your most strategically important one, the one who relies on you for uptime critical operation. Then sit down and say this.
I want to show you something. Here is our uptime log for the last 6 months, and here are the dates when Eskom had scheduled or unscheduled outages, and here is our performance during those outages. We maintained a 99.7% uptime while other suppliers went dark. That uptime isn't luck, it's infrastructure investment. We spend 75,000 Rand a month on backup power, redundant connectivity, and distributed operations to guarantee that performance. And we are now formalizing that guarantee as a Resilience SLA. So a contractual commitment to uptime regardless of external infrastructure conditions. You can stay on the standard service tier, which doesn't include that SLA, or you can upgrade to the resilience tier, which does. So the premium is 15 to 20% on your current contract.
Now here's what happens. The price sensitive clients say no, and that's fine. Let them say 15% and take the risk that their other supplier goes down. But the clients who are sophisticated, the ones who understand that downtime costs them multiples of what they are paying, they say yes, because you just turned an invisible cost into a sellable feature. So you're not selling a software anymore, you're selling certainty in an uncertain market. And that is something your international competitors literally cannot offer, because they've never had to build for it. So now let's go to the second move. And let's say you fund your infrastructure separately from your growth. So this is the blended finance move. Here's the mistake I see all the time. Founders raise a round of capital. Let's say it's 2 million Series A. and they deploy that capital across the entire business. So they invested in product, in hiring, in marketing, and infrastructure. So they are using expensive equity dollars to buy a diesel generator. They are using VC money, which should be compounding at 30 to 40% annually, to fund an asset that depreciates and generates zero revenue. You see, that is a terrible capital allocation. And it's one of the reasons South African startups burn through rounds way faster than their international peers. And here is how we fix it. So let's segment your capital stack. Infrastructure should be funded with debt or infrastructure specific capital. We have like your development finance institution, your DFIs, that exist specifically to fund infrastructure in emerging markets. So these guys, they want you to deploy capital into generators, solar installation, logistic hubs, and cold chain facilities, and they will give you up to 8 to 10% interest rates on infrastructure debt. So that is dramatically cheaper than the 25 to 35% cost of equity that a VC is expecting. So here's a move. When you're structuring your next round, split the raise. And we'll take equity capital goes to, like, let's say your product development, your hiring, your customer acquisition, the things that actually compound. Then we split it with debt, or let's say your DFI capital, that goes to generators, your UPS systems, your redundant connectivity, and logistic infrastructure, the things that depreciate but are necessary for operation. You see, this does two things. Number one, it reduces your dilution. So you are not giving away equity to buy assets that don't generate growth. And number two, it signals to equity investors that you understand capital efficiency, and that makes you more attractive, not less. So there are founders listening to this right now who could cut their equity raise by 30% and replace it with infrastructure debt, and their cap table would be dramatically cleaner as a result of that. So the third move is let's say we treat our operational resilience as intellectual property. This is the exportable move. So every process you have built to navigate the innovation penalty, your load shedding protocols, your logistic redundancy plans, your distributed team playbooks, those are not just internal SOPs, they are products. I mean, think about Shopify. Shopify started as an internal tool to run an online snowboard shop. They realized that the infrastructure they built to run their own store was more valuable than the store itself, so they productized it. And you need to do the same thing with your resilience infrastructure. Let's say you are running a cold chain logistic hub. You have built a proprietary system for managing refrigeration during power outages. You have load shedding prediction models that tell you when to pre-cool the unit. You have, let's say, a backup power sequencing that minimizes your diesel burn. So that system right now is helping your business run. But you know who else needs that system? Every other cold chain operator in the sub-Saharan Africa, in South Asia, or in Latin America. You could license that system, you could sell it as a SaaS product, and you could spin it out as a separate business. So the point is, the infrastructure you build to survive is itself a moat, and moats are defensible. And defensible business attract capital on better terms. So this is how you flip the script. The innovation penalty isn't a cost, it's R&D that your competitors haven't had to do, basically. So which means they can't compete when they enter your environment. So let me give you two examples of South African companies that figured this out. Not perfectly, but well enough to survive and scale. And the first case study is your Checkers 60. Everybody knows Checkers, which is the grocery delivery service that promises to get your order to you in 60 minutes. So in a market where Eskom can cut power at any time or any moment, and Transnet delays have a broken supply chains across the country, how did these guys do it? So what they did was they didn't try to fix Eskom. They didn't want to wait for Transnet to improve. They built around the infrastructure. So they invested heavily on their own dark stores, like having micro-fulfillment centers that are independently powered. They built predictive algorithms that pre-position inventory based on load shedding schedules. So they use a distributed fleet model so that if one area goes dark, they can reroute from adjacent zones. And here's the key, they priced for it. They didn't try to compete with the cheapest option. They charged a premium for a speed and reliability. And customers paid for it, because in a market where certainty is scarce, people will pay for guaranteed delivery. And 60-second isn't just a delivery service, it's a case study in how to productize resilience. And second case study is I've been talking to a founder who runs a small scale electronics manufacturing in Gauteng. And load shedding hit hard like in 2022, 2023. I mean, these guys, they had a choice to shut down the outages or invest in power resilience. And they chose the resilience. But they did something quite clever here. So they didn't just buy a generator, they installed the solar plus battery storage plus a generator, a small generator, as a hybrid system. So the capex was higher, which was about 800,000 upfront, but their OPEX was dramatically lower because they were running on solar for 70% of operating hours. And then they did the Resilience SLA move. They went to their B2B clients, companies that were buying components from them, and they said,
We can now guarantee delivery timelines that no one else in the market can match because while our competitors are offline for like 4 to 6 hours a day, we are running continuously.
they raised their prices by 12%, and then they didn't lose a single client from that because the clients did the math and realized that the 12% premium was cheaper than the downtime cost of unreliable supply. I mean, that company is now being courted by a private equity firm that wants to scale the model across other manufacturing verticals because they didn't just solve the power problem, they monetized the solution. That's the blueprint. All right, we've covered the three moves: the resilience SLA, the blended finance tech, the IPification of your operation resilience. So those are tactical. And tactics do matter, but tactics without a mindset shift are just band-aids. So before we close this episode, I want to talk about the mindset, the philosophy, the reason you are still here, still building despite the penalty. Because here's the thing, this is extremely hard. I don't want to lie to you. I'm not going to pretend it isn't. I mean, paying 50K a month just to keep the lights on while watching founders in other markets deploy the same capital into growth is demoralizing. I mean, watching your best engineers get recruited by overseas companies that can offer them stability you can't guarantee. I mean, that hurts. And I see you. I know it's hard, but I also know something else. The founders who are still standing in South Africa in 2025, after everything that has happened over the last 5 years, you are not the same people who started. You've been forged. You have been stress tested in ways that founders in Berlin and San Francisco will never experience. And that forging, that is your unfair advantage. And I'm going to talk about now the war cry, the manifesto, the reason we are not leaving the environment we're currently in. And side note here, I'm recording this in a room that isn't soundproof. You can probably hear the hum of the air conditioner in the background. Maybe some street noise if you listen closely. There's no foam on the walls, no studio grade microphone. This is just me, a laptop, a decision that I wasn't going to wait for perfect conditions to start. So I'm telling you this because I need you to understand something. The cornerstone, this show, this project, this entire idea exists because of the innovation penalty, not despite it. I could have waited like when I have the budget for a proper studio setup, when I have the perfect equipment, or when the market conditions improve, then I'll start. But what I've realized is waiting for perfect conditions is itself a form of paralysis that kills companies in the market. So waiting for the perfect condition is itself a form of paralysis that kills companies in the market. You see, the innovation penalty doesn't just tax your capital and your time, it taxes your permission to start. And it makes you feel like you need to have everything solved before you can even begin. And that is a lie. The companies that are winning in South Africa right now, the ones that are not just surviving but growing, they didn't wait for the grid to stabilize or the logistics to improve or the investor settlements to shift. They started in the imperfect conditions and they built the plane while flying it. So that is what I need you to take from this episode, basically. Not just the tactics, not just the data, but the posture itself. You do not need permission to build in hard market. You just need to start. So let me reframe this entire thesis of this episode one more time, because I think this is the part that most people miss. The innovation penalty, the 50,000 rand a month, the decision fatigue, the brain drain, the talent loss, all of that is real. I'm not minimizing it. I'm not telling you to think positive or just hustle harder or any of that motivational nonsense. But here's the question I want you to sit with. What if the penalty you've been paying for the last 3 to 5 or 7 years, what if it wasn't wasted? What if that was tuition? Because here's what you know now that founders in stable markets don't. You know how to operate with zero margin of error. You know how to maintain uptime when the grid fails. You know how to build a distributed team when physical offices become unreliable. You know how to price for uncertainty. You know how to manage cash flow when revenue is lumpy because your clients are also navigating the same infrastructure chaos. So you know how to run a business in hard mode. And hard mode is not the exception. Hard mode is the global default. You see, there are 4 billion people living in the markets with infrastructure challenges comparable to or worse than South Africa's. 4 billion. That is more than half the world's population. And every single one of those markets is underserved by the venture backed Silicon Valley trained companies that only know how to operate when the power is on and the roads are working. So let me tell you what I see when I look at the South African founder who has survived the innovation penalty. I see someone who has paid the most expensive MBA tuition in the world. And they didn't pay it to a university, they paid it to reality. And now they have a skill set that is scarce, valuable, and exportable. So you are not disadvantaged, you are dangerous. You just haven't realized it yet. So here's my ask. If you are still building in South Africa, if you are still here despite the outages and logistic failures and the brain drain and the funding winter and all of it, basically, I need you to stop apologizing. Stop hiding your infrastructure cost in your pitch deck. Stop pretending your unit economics are comparable to a company in Amsterdam. Stop treating the innovation penalty as something to be ashamed of. Because what you are doing is harder, and harder means rarer, and rarer means more valuable. So when you eventually scale, and you will, if you survive, you are not going to be competing with the Berlins, your London, San Francisco's on their terms. So you are going to be entering markets they can't touch. You're going to be solving problems they don't understand, and you're going to be winning deals they can't service because you know something that they don't. You know how to build when the market conditions are not perfect, and that is the most important skill in the world. So, to close this episode, this is the Cornerstone, episode 1, season 0. And next week, we are talking about the fortress mentality and why most successful South African startups are starting to look more like private firms than tech companies. But until then, keep building because the penalty you are paying today is the moat you will defend tomorrow.